right? I'll clutch my tea here for the and the people. Good to see all the people. It is ah okay. It is good to see the people then. Hmm. And so these are the instructions that come from on high. Yes. And so welcome then, to the dusk here on the West Coast, where the same wind that is lifting the trees that I can look through the shop window and see now will make their way across this great land. And eventually, I don't know if it will be the same wind or maybe it will be a different wind. We don't really know where the winds begin and end now, do we? But I would expect that the same winds somehow would caress you and perhaps to bring the same inspiration of understanding to what we are trying to delve into here and now. So it's a power ballad. Could we actually say it that way? It is a power ballad, which is essentially the stuff of the ancient opera that we have inherited as our own particular art form, right? The moral drama, the Western power ballad, the moral drama of a simpler time of an open landscape and a sense of space and vastness that has a certain kind of timeless quality that creeps its way into individuals and into individual characters, the sense of space now, the particularity of the land upon which they are making their way. That sense of space speaks to every individual in their own particular way. And certain explosive areas of life are touched upon. At least that is what we come to understand, you and I, as inheritors of this history, of this mythological history, of this poetic history, of this history of memory and story and lore and drama of a land which we somehow, are all in varying degrees of intimate relation to, of this land, this primordial land, which has embodied for us primordialness. The Western landscapes I'm talking about. The Western power ballads I'm talking about. The stuff of the ancient moral dramas, the charged moral dramas. And what is a charged moral drama but a charged mythical drama? And what is a mythical drama but the history of an individual mythical personality? And, what's an individual mythical personality? Well, in reality, of course, it's you and I looking out from the windows of our eyes, looking out from the mansions of our mind, feeling the breeze that blows over all of us in one way or in another and touches us each in our own particular way. The mythical drama is actually lived out and understood in individuals, in the individuals who attend to them, and that is you and I. But it's also a mythical drama in other more problematic senses of the word myth. And what is a mythic landscape but a charged and interdependent net of relationships of all kinds? And some of the connections collect in places of crossroads of strands and interdependencies and nodes and modes and places where signals can be mixed and crossed, but always charged and loaded with all kinds of purpose and meaning, sometimes intended and sometimes unintended, charged and sometimes disproportionate and sometimes morally flawed. But all of these relationships and all of these possibilities of crossed wires, they become the field. They become the field of interlocking possibilities where certain mythic energy centers are touched by the wind of events. And this becomes history. And this becomes a mythical history that we each understand in and of ourselves, in that it contributes to our own sense of what constitutes the human image, which is the human image, the form that we all kind of like gravitate to and take some notion of our identity of, a field of morality, a field of charged and flawed choices. A field of human endeavor, the field of humanity taking place in a larger field, the field of the cosmos, the field in which the human drama takes place, which is full of even larger and vaster nets of charged and flawed and also perfect nets of interdependent possibility. The field of the cosmos, the field of the human drama, the field of reality. And then, of course, there's an even more constricted and smaller field. And what would we call that? We might call that the field of the state, or the field of opportunity, or the field of winning and losing, or a field of the most basic elemental survival drama, a field of a kind of a finite kind of what? A field of a finite conflict with winners and losers, a certain kind of game, like the basic, almost the basic and base, basic in the sense of base, mean in the sense of average, the human mean, the human drama, the conflicts of interest. This could be what I'm saying. The conflicts of interest. The larger field of human relationships, and then the larger field of cosmic relationships. That's the kind of the background with which this Western ballad begins to appear. Well, as always, it involves origins. It involves a primeval landscape. It involves the landscape of the buffalo. It involves the landscape of the mountains and the prairies. It involves the landscape of the endless vistas that were there before the human eye first perceived them. And yet, even at the same time, there was human beings conscious in their inner eye as they looked upon a primordial landscape which had no end and no beginning that they could see. And yet they were able to somehow embody a notion of its vastness in the forms that their hands could create, in the landscape paintings, but also in the primordial creation stories and the origin stories told long before we knew how we could even conceive of them as having a beginning, and continuing to be told, ending after ending, in all the new forms that human consciousness embodies itself in as it goes on in the long human story. Well, the primordial landscape then. And in this case, we just have to close our eyes and then open them again and see this ancient primordial human landscape. And we will see the buffalo. And we will see the buffalo in all the magnificence of the buffalo, and the deep, vast bulk of the inner body of the buffalo is the seed of every tool, is the seed of every life-giving form that will come from the sacred heart of the buffalo, the medicine animal of the buffalo, which will, in drama after drama, conflict after conflict, make itself available to the human beings who are more recent arrivals on the landscape than the buffalo is. There's the buffalo. There's the buffalo walking in their magnificent medicine power. And then there's Coyote. And Coyote has a different kind of power. Coyote's power is elusive even to Coyote. Coyote's power is elusive to Coyote because Coyote's interests are very much, sometimes, like those of a human being. Coyote's interests are very much centered sometimes on the short term of the human drama, on gaining the advantage, on winning and losing, on surviving at the expense of someone else, on getting the better of someone else. Coyote can be this way, opportunistic, a certain kind of energy which is not part of the buffalo in their magnificent, on-standingness. So there are the buffalo, and then there is Coyote, and Coyote is saying to the buffalo, "Oh, buffalo, look at you." Coyote is observing the buffalo. He is observing their skinny legs and their paunchy bellies and their gigantic shoulders and their shaggy fur and their horns and their black and dark inscrutable eyes. And he is saying to them, "Why were you made this way?" And the buffalo are saying out of the inner awareness of their very being, "Great Spirit made us this way." Coyote said, "How fast can you run?" See, it's Coyote who does this. He introduces this instigating concept to the primordial life-giving life of the primordial creature, in this particular instance exemplified in the buffalo. And he says to them, "How fast can you run? Can you run faster than me?" And in saying this, he introduces not only a sense of his own relationship to them, but a sense of his relationship to them in terms of like the most primordial and powerful energies of living beings in this primordial landscape. And he's also introducing this element of conflict and this notion of interest, so much so that, well, I'm relating it to you now, what Coyote said to them. He wanted to see who could run faster, and so they say, "Well, let's find out." Or Coyote's the one who says, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll run a race, and we'll see who gets to a farthest point before the other. But I'll tell you what, let's do one more thing. When I lay my robe down," Coyote says, referencing something that he has made or has been given to him as a gift, some external thing to his actual corporal form. "I will lay my robe down in the course of our race. And when we get to that place, then we will close our eyes, O buffalo. We will close our eyes and we will jump, keeping our eyes closed." And the buffalo say, "Okay, Coyote, we will do this." And, well, this is just like a primordial trickster tale. Coyote tricked the buffalo into running this race. He told them to close their eyes at a certain point and jump. And he told them to close their eyes at the edge of a cliff. And they jumped off the edge of a cliff. And it was in this way that Coyote taught the people how to hunt the buffalo. There were different ways that they would hunt the buffalo. Sometimes they would hunt them with bow and arrows and other weapons. And other times they would chase them off of cliffs. And they studied the buffalo. The people became... Well, you can say that the people became one with the buffalo in certain ways of relating to them. In other ways that you can see that the buffalo and the people had this relationship where the buffalo offered its life to the people. And the buffalo joined in the great circle of life by offering his life to the people and offering all the elements of his body to the people so that the people could take and eat and make and learn and wonder and establish their lives as this kind of like central cultural force. This was the buffalo in their relation to the human beings that lived at that time in the primordial landscape. Oh, but then other forms of understanding came along. And the other forms of understanding changed the magical world and the magical nature of the buffalo in their magical relationship to the human beings who lived upon them and revered them and honored them and built a picture of the buffalo and the energies of the buffalo into a larger picture of a living network of life and a living awareness of relationships of all natural forms. And it was like one cohesive vision of life, which is available to us in our imaginations even now. I'm not saying that we understand it, I'm not saying that we have plumbed every aspect of it in any sense that might make any sense to anyone else, like on some social level, but actually just in our inner being, we can feel in ourselves this living and magical and fragile and complex interdependent understanding of the nature of all life and how it fits together. And this was Well, this is basically the conception of another form of life. Yes, this is basically the conception of a form of life that, as we know, as we study our own doleful history, we know that was what? Erased or set aside, or harshest of all, made meaningless with this, onrushing advance of a different kind of energy, of a different kind of human motivation, of a different kind of organized human motivation, of a different kind of civilization, of a different kind of economy, which came upon this primordial landscape and altered all the relationships in such a way that it became a challenge to even be aware of what was the original insight that held the whole thing together. Which is just this imaginative and moral understanding. It became impossible to hold on to anymore. The buffalo became a commodity. The living form of the buffalo, the life energy of the buffalo as this place where the conversion of the energy that the sun gives to the seed in the ground and makes the grass grow, which the buffalo eats and converts into the energy of the buffalo and all the ways that its form manifests as it lives its life. And then as the human beings interrelate with the buffalo feeds them in their life. And it's just this whole living interrelationship was wiped out, seemingly, except to us here and now, but was seemingly wiped out by this different kind of understanding of the economy and understanding of value of living forms. The buffalo became a commodity. The buffalo became a cash crop. So many ways in which this tragic kind of transition of understanding took place under the weight of necessity, and necessity is such a harsh master. And necessity came to understand that there was a market for buffalo robes on the east coast of the United States. The people who could afford it could cover their bodies and go for sleigh rides and stay warm in the New York winters and the Boston winters and the Philadelphia winters and the cold northern winters with buffalo robes. And the people in the cities, with their different understanding of economic realities, began to understand that they could have these things for use, and they could invent and create uses for the different parts of the buffalo, very, very different than the furthering of the ongoing nature of the life lived by the native people who had a different and sacred relationship to the buffalo. They found that they could take the buffalo leather and the buffalo sinews, and they found that they could use them in their factories to make tracks and conveyor belts and drive the gears of their great machines and make the robes to cover their bodies. And pretty soon an industry arose out of that industrial conception. An industry arose of buffalo hunting, aided and abetted by so many technological innovations. Among them, firearms. Among them, the techniques of using firearms accurately to put an end to the life of these creatures whose bodies were more valuable dead than alive. And a whole system and a whole way of harvesting. I don't even know if I want to call it harvesting. It's not quite agriculture. It's industry. It's agriculture insofar as it's like happening in a rural place, but it's actually rural industry, the hunting of the buffalo, and all of the economic pressures that were involved in that, and all the new ways and the new disciplines and the new ways of going about harvesting and exploiting this natural resource of the buffalo. And what was left were piles of bones and contents of the living body hauled away and put on trains and measured and weighed and tabulated and cataloged and sent east to buyers in the marketplace and changed into a whole kind of sad and marketplace exchange. So much so that, soon this landscape, so original and so primordial, was altered in such a fundamental way because the buffalo were being removed from the scene. The buffalo were being emptied out. Not to mention, of course, the violent conflicts between the people who were coming and the people who were already there, and resulting in the displacement of the original people, and all of the whole tragedy of this tragic meeting of cultures, which is, of course, in so many words, the history of the settlement of the American West. Well, but the land still remained. The space still remained. The buffalo were displaced, and there were people who knew and understood in their way what was going on, and there were people who were observers of everything that was happening, and they were somehow, though, set apart from the push and pull of the immediate necessity that was motivating the people who were involved in like the original endeavors. There were other people who were observing and watching it all and understanding that, government policies, there are ways that this could have been avoided. There are ways to protect this species of animal which has contributed so much to the natural order of things, which is now being wiped out. There are ways in which we can protect this. But beware the gift of prophecy. I mean, these were the people, the natural scientists, and the people who were not involved in the immediate profit-taking of the whole thing. But they were the ones who could see that, we can set a policy and we can have regulations to keep this deep and dense and harsh exploitation from happening, which is creating harm to the natural environment from which we take our original sustenance. And they wrote and they made their insights available, and that was there, and that's part of what we inherit as well. Now we understand it as like a record of those who saw differently than the momentum, the onslaught, the relentlessness of necessity, which caused this, the vast loss of the species and of its habitat. But anyway, nature abhors a vacuum. And when the buffalo were subdued, and when the buffalo were practically made extinct, I mean, at the lowest point of the buffalo's existence, there was maybe like 24 buffalo left in places like in the Yellowstone Basin. I mean, it got to be where the buffalo came this close to being totally wiped out, like, a great many species had been wiped out before. But even at this time, there were people who had been educated in such a way in natural history to see that this was what was happening. And they were able to write down some kind of like record so that we can, as we try to understand everything that happened, we can kind of like make reference to them, as I'm doing now in such a general way. But there were people who understood that this is going on and who could see the need to kind of preserve what was still left. And in many ways they did succeed. The buffalo did not go extinct. But anyway, nature abhors the vacuum. And there was now a vast and open range. And in the United States, the American Civil War had ended. And that whole conflict between the states and all the reasons that it came about, all its causes, and all the disruptions it caused in the cohesiveness of the original American unit. It used to be that it was the Mississippi River and the tributaries of the Mississippi, the Ohio, and some of these other rivers and on the barges, that was the main avenue of commerce between North and South. But when the Civil War occurred, that avenue of commerce became cut off, and that caused all these different kinds of changes and everything. And no longer were like, pigs, speaking of livestock, pigs can be herded onto a barge, onto a riverboat, and sent down by river traffic and sent from north to south. And this was meat. This was the transfer of meat and the commerce of meat. The buying, selling of meat in Cincinnati was a great slaughterhouse of pigs, and the blood of the pigs was poured into the Ohio River. But the Civil War put an end to that because commerce between North and South was cut off. This caused all these economic changes. You could write extremely detailed expositions of this, and I'm only just speaking of it in the most general way. But at certain points, Cincinnati, the slaughterhouse capital, was displaced by Chicago. And Chicago became the place where meat was made, where livestock on the hoof, living animals became livestock on the hoof. And then they were transformed into a product which could be packaged and delivered and sold to other places far from where they had originally been living animals, changed into food, changed into packaged food. You know, in Chicago, the meat packing capital of the world. And so somewhere, somehow, I guess because cattle, it became the taste of the people in the cities shifted, and there began to be more of an appetite for beef. And as the Civil War ended, the North and South traffic was changed, and Chicago had become kind of like the center, the crossroads of commerce. And the cities were growing. The industrial eastern seaboard was now kind of like coming into its own as a new form of life, of industrial life, of urban life, of dense populations who needed food that wasn't necessarily grown locally, but food that came from some other place, commerce of things and products over vast and larger distances, a totally different set of values and relationships than the original magical relationship, of the buffalo. Now it's like commodities moving through all these different industrial kind of ways, commodities and packaged things, and still there's this human necessity to eat, to maintain existence, but now it's being satisfied in all these more and more industrialized and commercialized ways. It's vast, and we're only beginning to even really understand the nature of what it actually means. But there were, across the ocean, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in Scotland and England, this was at a time, this was the beginning of the Gilded Age, this was when Britain was at the height of her power as a colonial colossus, ruling, 1/5 of the world, and seemingly dominating the industrial and economies of commerce all over the world. And even within England, even within Scotland, there were all these kind of like economic pressures and all these kind of economic inequalities and sufferings and changes and shifts. And in places like Edinburgh, in places like Glasgow, I think mainly in Edinburgh, there had been a thriving linen industry, spinning and weaving, once a cottage industry, beginning back in the time when William Blake, our original insight person, first saw it from the very beginning, this displacement of cottage industries into these like hell wheels of industrial quantified mass production, the mill wheels and the turning and the exploitation of labor that was once done down on the farm, according to the sunset and the sunrise, was now conceived according to clock time and quantities and transactions and factories and all of this. So there was a linen industry in Edinburgh. And then there was the Crimean War, where in the far reaches of Crimea, the great Florence Nightingale, working in the wards to ease human suffering, conceived of a different way of delivering medical care and of expressing care for the wounded human beings. Florence Nightingale in the wards of Crimea, that's a whole other story. But the end result of the Crimean War was the closing off of the linen trade and the flax trade between the Baltic states and these factories in Scotland. But along about the same time, there was the Civil War in the United States of America. And for some reason, because of the war, they needed to have fibers, the rough vegetable fibers of a plant called the jute, to make wagon coverings and sails and burlap. And it was a rougher kind of thread from a rougher kind of plant, but they could, they could retrofit their linen factories to accommodate the different texture of the thread of the jute plant. And they were soon able to, and this is how it is, the way industry works, they were able to adapt to that change. The collapse of the linen trade led to a boom in the jute trade in these places in Scotland, and they made quite a little bit of money. And over in England at the same time, this transition between a feudal economy and a capitalist or industrial economy is long and ongoing and full of strange, inscrutable permutations. And at one time they passed these import laws. They called them the corn laws. And the original idea was to bring down the price of grains and staples like corn to make it so that they wouldn't be so expensive. So then the landowners could charge more rent. The aristocratic landowners could charge more rent for the for the serfs, for the crofters, they called them in Scotland, for the people of the land, of the fellaheen, who occupied their property without owning it. But for some reason or another, the rents were too high for them and they could not pay the rent, and so it became more profitable to evict the people who lived on the land, evict them and get them off the estates of the vast landowners in England and, of course, in Ireland. And these vast tracts of land were converted into game preserves and there became an interest in vacating these lands from the occupants who made a living locally, living there. And this is important to remember when we get to Wyoming. The law allowed this to happen because the law then, as now, is in its infancy. And there are all these mythical, charged and powerful and flawed relationships that we can sort of touch upon the mystery of dramatically and mythically in our own individual imaginations. But yet there's also the need somehow to translate these same relationships into an equitable system of legal understanding. And to create, a system of laws so that a society can continue to exist through the transitions of time with a sense of fair and equitable relationships and distribution and all that. The law, I say, is in its infancy then, and it is in its infancy now. And this gives us a chance to kind of look at it in that way. So the law allowed for the vast eviction of all these people that lived on the land. And at the behest of the landowners. And the people in Scotland who were able to capitalize upon the jute trade made a lot of money. And with this making of all of this money, there came a different kind of sense of the notion of transactions of value. And this notion of, I cannot even explain all the economic terms, but this notion of value became more and more abstract, and there became this kind of sense of selling shares of potential profit. There became this kind of notion of venture capitalism, and there became this kind of notion of you can speculate, you can see, you can prognosticate, and you can imagine the ways that there are opportunities. You can look into the changes of time in a way that you can capitalize on your own opportunity to accrue more of the means of value, to become more of a significant person. somehow. And this becomes the motivator of people in the world. Ah, how absurd. and yet here we are. And here we were then too, And so, so the Civil War ended, and it came to be that in places like Texas, there were these cattle. There were cows. There were cattle that had been there since the time introduced by the Spanish in their vast land holdings, way early on. And this way of taking care of them, the vaqueros, this way of taking care of cattle that required large tracts of land. And the cattle were basically, like the buffalo, right? They're hooved animals. They eat the grass. They convert the grass. They convert the energy of the sun, the magic of the seed into life, which is their own life, which is then somehow transmitted to human beings, either in a magical way or an industrial and commodified way. And with the buffalo came out and the cattle came in. But these particular cattle in Texas, they were wild. They were descendants of two different strains of cattle. Spanish cattle that had been in the United States since or in America, or in this land mass since the 16th century, if not before, and then other forms of cattle that came in later, kind of in like different kind of breeds. They were basically wild creatures, sort of domesticated because they could kind of belong to these people upon whose land they were. But there was a lot of land that was in the public domain, and just like unscripted land in Texas, and they ate them. And they took care of them, and they used them for leather and other things like that. But it had never been until the end of the Civil War, there had never been a notion that you could actually take these cattle and sell them to the people who lived, in the big cities to the east and to the north. But it soon became something that opportunistically people could realize that, all we've got to do is take these wild cattle hiding in the thickets here in Texas with this devastated war economy, and we can gather them together, and we can drive them as drovers, and people have been taking care of domesticated creatures, since the beginning of time. So this is a basic primordial human activity. We can group these animals and send them down these roads and these routes from one place to another place, and we can sell them, and we can get money for them in these other places, people we don't even see who have use for them. And so this whole kind of notion of economic activity began to take shape. And they would take the cattle and they would gather them together, and they would establish ownership, through the brand, the ancient symbols of the different kind of, to establish ownership, they would sear the symbol of that particular ruling entity, that ranch, and they would sear it into the haunch, into the flesh of the cow. And then as the herds increased, those calves, the offspring of those livestock became part of the herds, and the herds accumulated in value. This is a basic and ancient human activity. But now they could buy and sell them. They could drive them north. They could drive them, there was the railroad, and rather than the rivers going north and south, the railroads began to expand from the east to the west. And every year that passed, the railroads were going farther and farther west, you see. And the people began sometimes they would drive the cattle to the railheads, as they called them, to the place where the rail cars, the empty stock cars, they could load the cattle onto the rail cars and send them east to Chicago, where they would be changed into meat. Or maybe they would be sent live and shipped farther east, where they could become, there was all these different kind of arrangements that they had. But in the beginning, it wasn't just in those places that they went. Sometimes they would go farther north and farther west to the fortresses, way out at the edge of the frontier in places like Wyoming and Montana, and also New Mexico and Utah sometimes, though settlement was there a little bit delayed, I think, or a little bit took a little different form. But they would go to these places also, and but this notion of taking cattle, large masses of them, and going from one place to another and buying and selling them became something that that became a part of the economy, that became a part of human endeavor. And then in England, there was this notion, this different kind of like financial kind of like vision, where they were rich in capital and they were eager to establish a kind of understanding of how to proceed as an industrialist in this kind of speculative way. And it became all these financial institutions kind of like had their start at this time in the world of cattle. There were correspondents from financial magazines in England and in Scotland who came to America in the 1870s and saw what was happening, the growth of these urban centers and this increasing desire for cattle as a food source. And there was all this capital in England and Scotland, and there was all this land and possibility in America, and there became these kind of like these financial structures, shareholders, stock corporations, and with the buffalo being gone, all this land opened up, and people, as they drove the cattle north, they began to realize that, cattle can live up here too. If we take care of them, on the open range, they can find forage and they can live through the winters. And this way of life, this way of raising cattle, this way of receiving capital from across the Atlantic Ocean demands large tracts of land in the public domain. And here it is. Here are the conditions where our fortunes can be made. And this, in a generalized way, is the beginning of the cattle industry of the 1870s through about the 1890s in places like Wyoming and Montana, even before they were states, when they were territories. So vast ranches appeared, and they attracted vast personalities larger than life, in a mythical sense. And when we begin to look at some of these mythical personalities, we can look and see, the hubris, and the God complex, and the privilege, that caused it to be that these people established an industry in the wilderness, and of such a magnitude that they became almost like megalomaniacal. And it became like, a transmutation of the feudal system, only on a much wider scale than it had been in the old country. These vast ranchers, megalomaniacs, larger than life figures, some of them. But some of them were actually, we know in our own individual selves, some of them actually were moral beings, and their testimony still lives today kind of in our psyches and everything. So, we can perhaps say some of their names. I mean, after all, some of them they were Americans raised on the eastern seaboard, raised under conditions of privilege. They went to places like Harvard. They went to places like Yale. And somehow or another, because of their family connections, it became possible for them to purchase when I say purchase large tracts of land, actually I mean to say they had access to large tracts of land that were basically their own, though actually legally they were not their own. But let us remember that the law is a thing now and then in a state of infancy, but they were able to take advantage of access to these vast tracts of land. And because of the foreign capital from England and Scotland, they were able to undertake huge ranches and things, and a whole new way of life began to take shape. And Hubert Teschemacher and Dubillier, I can't remember his first name, and Harvard boys who came out west and fell under the allure of the possibilities, and in some sense also the beauty of the place, the remoteness of the place spoke to them. And they had certain classmates, among them Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt who was raised under the most fortunate of circumstances, with great wealth and with great access to education that was, as it was unfolding in a very creative way at that time, even as a child. He could study the skeletons and the taxidermy of things, and Herbert Spencer and Charles Darwin and the Natural History Museum in New York and everything, and then he went to Harvard and all of this, and was parented so every circumstance of life, emotionally and materially, actually, you could say, was his. But then, life being what it is, tragedy did strike him too. His father passed away. His mother and his wife passed away on the same day, and when he was a young man. And it's part of the legend, Once these nodes of understanding are touched upon, a life becomes legendary, a life becomes mythical. And then being mythical, you kind of have to just take it on its own terms. And you can step back and be judgmental about it, of course, and be right, later on in terms of expansive and belligerent and imperialistic and all of this. But at the same time, on a human level, you can understand how someone like Teddy Roosevelt, at the example of his friends who go out west and buy these ranches, well, so did Teddy Roosevelt. He went out west and he found something in himself. He found an awareness of the space and the land around him, which brought about kind of a healing in his mind from the grief, and sort of rescued him from overthinking in a certain sense, and introduced him to a whole different way of life and a whole wild melancholy of the landscape, which really did speak to him. And he wrote a lot of books, and they're very honest in their own particular way. But let me tell you this, to make a long story short, because I cannot, go into a whole long thing about someone like Teddy Roosevelt, but as a mythical presence, let us be aware of one particular insight that he really did have, in the course of his life. And I'm talking about these people because in a certain sense, it's like they are sort of exemplary in their fate and in their relationship to their space and in their time, so that we have to understand the mystery of them even now. And Teddy Roosevelt would say something he would say, and he did say this, in the course of his speech, which of course later on his career became, he became all the great things that Teddy Roosevelt became in public life. No need to really go into the specifics of that, of course. But he did say in a certain speech later on, when he was beginning his ascent into national politics, he said something to the effect of, it is hard to fail. It is worse to never have tried to succeed. And there are those whose success comes through genius. Teddy Roosevelt said this. I'm paraphrasing it. Teddy Roosevelt, though, basically understood this. There are those whose success comes through genius. Teddy Roosevelt offered as an example of this genius Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, whose conception of the United States brought it out of the grave of its suicided fate in the Civil War, and he was able to, out of his own mind, conceive of a new nation dedicated, to this idea of equality and the rights of the individual in a more kind of abstract, compact or unity out of all these different kinds of peoples and different kinds of endeavors and different kinds of values and different kinds of fortunes and different kinds of fates. Abraham Lincoln was able to bring that out of his mind, out of his own inner mind from the inside. But Teddy Roosevelt knew, Teddy Roosevelt said this is not the genius of someone like me. There are those whose genius, says Teddy Roosevelt, comes from their inner mind, like Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address when he reconceived of the nation. But then there are those whose success comes from daring to do what has never been done before. And that's Teddy Roosevelt talking about himself. Those who dare to do what has never been done before, like go out west after facing tragedy and debacle and establishing a notion of themselves in this vast landscape, and a daring do and a dauntlessness and all of this, and then fighting corruption as a politician, fighting corruption, and Teddy Roosevelt, is the one who took the insights of those people who watched the slaughter of the buffalo and realized that it could have been prevented, and had the means and the ideas and the access to the policy making centers of government to have prevented this. But Teddy Roosevelt is the one who was able to take their insights and actually make it into an actual plan of policy and action. And it's because of Teddy Roosevelt's insight into the whole natural beauty of the world that we were able to, as a country, set aside certain land formations and take them out of the destructive dynamic of commerce, so that their wilderness could be preserved. And it's actually, because of Teddy Roosevelt's insight and his understanding, and came from his inner being. Anyway, for him, it was daring. That was the inspiration for his success. It wasn't something that came out of the inner life of the mind like it was for Lincoln. For Teddy Roosevelt, it was daring and going ahead and kind of like doing these things. A man of action, you might say. And so he found a certain aspect of his daemon in the West, along with some of these other vast and huge ranchers. All right now, but now I've got to get more close to the original subject matter of this. Oh, good. And we're doing okay with time. There was boom times. There was really, this is nothing new in the economic history of our country. There's boom and there's bust and there's speculation and there are bonanzas and there are wild opportunities and wild possibilities and wild ways this is capitalized on and exploited. And for a time, it became the expansive impetus that gave us the identity, of the cattle industry and the great American West, and a whole way of life and a whole economy in a particular place that so defined it as it became part of this great compact, which is the union of these states. And the conditions were right at a certain time for a certain period of time, but then things changed. Things changed in so many ways because it was based upon complicated speculations and financial transactions. It's going to be inherently unstable because these things are taking place and envisioned against the background of an environment that is actually a natural environment with its own kind of rules and its own dynamics, which are only understood in a wishful way by enterprising human beings, that inevitably things are going to happen that cause the bubble to burst. Now, there were people such as Granville Stewart, he's another rancher out there in Montana, north of Wyoming, and along about 1886, well, there's a lot of things that were happening and had been happening for a while. There were other centers of power, the meat packers in Chicago and the railroads. They were coming up with innovative ways to package their product in a way that saved them money at the expense of their competitors and all the other fields, and it was more difficult to satisfy your shareholders over in England and over in Scotland because the prices of things were not the way that they should be. And there was this expansive land and you wanted to keep taking advantage of the expansive possibilities, and people would leverage their properties and leverage their holdings and put themselves under pressure for things to turn out well. But there was something larger that was happening in the environment and in the climate. And long about 1886 or so, some of the ranchers who themselves, despite being, very shrewd-minded businessmen with an eye to the main chance, they themselves were sort of under the spell of this magnificent land, this magnificent way of life, this life that had become their own to discover. And they were noticing something along about 1885, in 1886, that was kind of strange. Granville Stewart started seeing, was it Granville Stewart or one of his, the cowboys on his ranch, Teddy Abbott, Teddy Blue, who noticed that there were what are those? Those are snowy owls. What are snowy owls doing down here? They began to notice, in other words, migratory birds that were not associated with that area before, and they were seeing them, and they were wondering what they were doing, and they were noticing patterns in the movement of the wild geese that they had never noticed before. Something was happening, something was going to happen, and something did happen. It was the winter of 1886 when Old Man Winter put his foot down on the northern ranges, put his foot down hardcore. All of these places that were once thought to be sheltered from the harsh vicissitudes of winter and nature, suddenly the people realized that the land was no longer spared from the harsh hand of Old Man Winter. They called it the Big Die-Up. Blizzard after blizzard occurred. Temperatures plummeted. The poor cattle, they had no food. These were wild animals insofar as they were free to wander on the open range in these lands of public domain, but which were understood in a very restrictive way by those who were making use of them, it's a setup for future problems, of course. But now it became very, very difficult to take care of the livestock. They were also domestic animals that you had to care for, and now they were like dying because of the winter, and it became really, really bad. And when springtime came and when the snow melted, there were as many bones of cattle, in a certain sense, as there had been bones of buffalo. With the buffalo, they had been decimated by a human industry. With the cattle, already the animals, the products of human industry, it was the climate itself that piled up the carcasses. And this kind of put a lot of people into a lot of financial distress. A lot of these big cattlemen, the bonanza was over now, and there were a great many other reasons. And along with that, there were misunderstandings of what was really going on. There was great embitterment among these entitled people. They had, in their own minds, they had caught a rising wave of opportunity, endeavor, of fortune, of circumstance. They were of the notion that the value of life was in expansion. Even Teddy Roosevelt, as a statesman who is saying something that is still true today, you can still see the biases, though, in his outlook. When he speaks of daring, when Teddy Roosevelt speaks of, yes, there's people like Abraham Lincoln who conceived out of their own minds a way to keep the Union together, and then there's people like us who see the opportunity and are daring and go where no one has ever gone before. People of action, people of adventure, right? What do they call it? Initiative. And all of these things. Well, that's great. That has its place. But that's only one element of the momentum of life. And when that meets its limits, then you have, human character exhibiting hubris. Then you have the stuff of Shakespearean tragedy. And this was what began to happen for these cattlemen. But now there's something very unique to America that is also going on. As I've mentioned, the law. The law was in its infancy. And many times these entrepreneurs in the wilderness building feudal empires in a place where nothing like that had ever happened before, at least in their own minds, they became a law unto themselves. And they began to manage the range in a way that their privilege and their achievement had made it possible for them to do certain things and never face the consequences. They were the ones who were utterly influential in creating the foundations of the society that began to emerge around what they had achieved. You know, for a time, Cheyenne, Wyoming, was the place with the highest per capita income, some say, the highest per capita income in the world for a while during this boom time. But when the bust came hard, and the fortunes of these people began to dwindle before their very eyes. But they had been creating a society, they had been creating an idea of their place in the society, and they had been taking advantage of lands in the public domain, but there was a certain kind of influence of the law that was not their influence in their conception of the law, and that was coming from the center of government, you know, on the eastern seaboard. And this open range land, this public domain land, there were certain aspects of the law that actually favored, that was not in their favor. For example, I'm talking about the Homestead Act, and I'm talking about, what did they call it? The Desert Reclamation Act. It became possible that when these public domain lands, they became available to smaller landholders. You know, what was it now? 160 acres for $10. This was the Homestead Act. If you worked it, it could become your own. This became the dream of so many people, many, many more people than the landed land barons with all their vast, conceptions of possibility. There was another kind of people. There were the smaller people, the people brought in by the Homestead Act, and the land laws from the East favored them. And the Desert Reclamation Act, what was it now, made it possible to have 640 acres, because they understood sort of that in the West, you know, that their conception of land law had to expand because for various reasons you needed access to more land, and that could still be done. You could, what was it now, 25 cents an acre. You could have 640 acres. For $10 down, you could have 160 acres. This was the Homestead Act and the Desert Reclamation Act. And as more and more people came in, like the grass, leaves of grass, as Walt Whitman said in his conception of democracy, the commonplace, each particularity, unique, so much more subtle, actually, in its understanding of human value than these larger-than-life personalities. It's just a different scale of myth, actually. But it's very much a part of our American mythos, you know, here and now. But anyway, the big die-up, the harsh winter, the collapse of the bubble economy, the growing power of the meat packers in Chicago and the railroad lines, and the further and further commodification, the changing of beef into steaks. And all of this, it made it harder for them. They were under all this financial pressure caused by all of their big ideas. But not only that, the range itself, the open range, was being taken over by all these small holders. You know, and they were buying up the land, and it was their land, but they were prohibiting, or it was more and more difficult to move, said the great cattleman. My own herds across this land, I cannot get access to the water here and here and here because of these small landholders. Oh, you know, there became a very much of a conflict of interest, and so many of them were English and Scottish, or bankrolled by English, Scottish interest, and the law, the infant law in those places was very much in the favor of those who owned the land, what they could do to clear the land for uses of their own. The law favored them. They could just get rid of these people, you know, back in England and Scotland. But then out here in the West, there were all these people that were coming much by the same way that they had come, only now there were so many of them, and to them it seems so unfair. The Homestead Laws and the Desert Reclamation Act make it possible for them to cut off access of our herds to water and to the choice grazing places in the land. And not only that, I haven't even mentioned the whole notion of the cowboy, but the cowboys themselves, the ones who worked for the ranchers and who actually took care of the cattle and conceived of a whole style and a whole way of being, they themselves were it was possible to take advantage of certain laws, like unbranded cattle, unbranded calves that were already weaned. Well, for a long time, they were up for grabs. And if you were a cowboy and you wanted to have your own herd, you could have access to those unbranded calves and you could start to build up a small herd for yourself. And this was okay for a while, but as the pressures came to bear upon the larger cattlemen, they began to clamp down upon those who had less power than them. And then here's where the times begin to do funny things and begin to get mirrory to our own times. There were different kinds of opportunists who came in upon the scene. And there were people like Frank Canton. The only thing we knew for sure about Frank Canton is his name actually wasn't Frank Canton. His name was actually Joe Horner. Joe Horner. And he had been in the Civil War. He had been an officer's orderly, and then he became a government teamster. He became involved in the cattle trails between Kansas and Texas. And he was a violent fellow as a teamster, and he ended up as a government teamster. He killed someone. He killed his boss. Speaking of, authoritarians. And he was put on trial before a military tribunal and was acquitted. He was acquitted as one of the first chapters in his criminal career. He was acquitted by a military tribunal from the very beginning. Did that give him a taste of a certain kind of success which would be available for people like that? Well, maybe, because then later on he became involved in bank robbery, stagecoach robbery. He spent time in jail. He escaped from jail, sawing through his shackles, sawing through the plaster wall, sawing through the wood. He escaped, and he was caught again, and he was sent to the state penitentiary in Huntsville, and he escaped from there, and he found himself up in Wyoming and changed his name from Joe Horner to Frank Canton, and lo and behold, like so many, there's not enough time to tell that story, but this criminal became a lawman in a weird way, a certain kind of lawman. He became a stock detective. Isn't that strange? And he became a sheriff. Oh, yeah, you could run for office and you could be a sheriff. And the only people voting in these remote places were people who were under the influence of the large landholders. So you could get elected sheriff, same way that you could do that back in England, actually, the Sheriff of Nottingham, Robin Hood, and all of that stuff. You could be on the side of the law now, but be basically the same person that you were before, looking for your main chance, regardless of any kind of moral law. And this is how he conducted himself. Oh, but he became entitled, I guess. He was simultaneously a stock detective for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and they were these large cattlemen, and they were interested in eradicating rustlers from their land, and there was no law, there was no court, there was the rope. But it's not the same as the Deep South. It's a different kind of vigilante justice. It's bad, but it's bad in a different way. There was so often no trials if you were accused of rustling. And there was rustling. It was definitely a problem in some places more than in others. And there were, people died under trees, from the rope, without any kind of a trial or anything like that. This happened. This was vigilante justice of a certain kind, and it was very much a part of what was going on. It's not to be understood in the same way that the vigilante justice that was going on in other parts of the country, though. There's the best, that I know of is probably that book, The Oxbow Incident, by Walter Van Tilburg Clark, which talks about a certain specific place of a certain kind of vigilante justice and the injustices that can occur because of that. And so this was happening, and this guy, Frank Canton, he was very much involved in all of that. And he saw a certain kind of opportunity. He realized, all these entitled ranchers, they are up against the wall now because of all the business pressures put upon them. Well, I can tell them something that they want to hear. I can tell them about the criminals. out here on the range. I can tell them that, you can worry about the winter, you can worry about the railroad monopolies to the east, you can worry about your creditors calling in their chits, but in reality, there's bad people nearby, and we can get them, and I know who they are. And, I'm not sheriff anymore. He lost his election to be sheriff to a guy named Red Angus, his name. He became the sheriff there in Wyoming, of Johnson County, Wyoming. And when he lost for his run for sheriff, he leaned into that much more his job with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and they were up against the wall. And Cheyenne was no longer a big boom town. Per capita income had fallen. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, their membership had fallen. At the same time, Wyoming was achieving statehood, and some of these very cattlemen who were in the Wyoming Stock Growers Association helped to draft the state constitution of Wyoming. And part of the draft of the Constitution, they were realizing, we're not going to be a territory anymore. We're going to be a state now with laws. The laws will not be in infancy anymore. We're going to have to come out against vigilante justice. And they wrote up the Constitution so as to seemingly say that there was not going to be any more of that taking the law into your own hands funny business. But then a short time later, some of those very same people did that very same thing because of lots of misinformation. A lot of misinformation, but a lot of actionable intelligence, regardless of whether it was true or not. They could do this, and so they did. And they were raised in that tradition of the landowner having absolute power over the people who were occupying the land. The law made it possible for their forebearers in England and Scotland to do the very thing that they were actually doing now in the wild, wild West. And so in about 1891, under great economic duress and feeling, no doubt very, very victimized and slandered and embittered, they conceived of a plan under the influence of that range detective, Frank Canton, and some of these other people who were just actually utterly from the very beginning, expansive and domineering and opportunistic. And there's just a very, very slight slip for that to go into real hardcore, violent, power abuse. And so eventually a harebrained notion occurred. They had the people that they wanted gone. They had a list, and they were many of the small cowboys who'd left. There were positions of, they were foremans of these larger cattle outfits, and they were building up their own herds, and then they would leave. And there was a couple of places in Wyoming and in Texas where the cowboys actually tried to form a cowboy union. They never did last very long, but they were asserting a certain kind of labor rights out west. And it wasn't due to the Finns or the Wobblies or anything like that. It was something utterly homegrown. But all it did really, they couldn't keep a strike together for a very long time. But what they could do, some of the ones who were openly involved in it, that put them, on the what they called the dead list or the death list, which there was a list of people that they wanted dead. And they were cowboys and landowners, and all they would do is accuse them of rustling. And then they had the will and the means and the financing. And Wyoming had recently become a state. And in a few years before this, there was already one ex-Governor Baxter, the current governor, Governor Barber, the two senators, Senator Carey, Senator Warren. They were all in on it, because the cattle industry was the only thing happening in Wyoming. And they had established the basic foundations of the society, and all of their biases were built into it. And they were facing this inundation in their own minds of small landowners, which was threatening their control and their power. And they had the ideology, and they had newspaper journalists who were on their side, of course, because what is opportunistic journalism but finding where the interests of the people are flowing and kind of capitalizing on that. And so they fell in, they went along for the ride. Oh, there's a rustler problem in Johnson County. We need to do something about it. And sometimes you have to go above the written law, as is sometimes said. And that is what they did. In April of 1891, they had a meeting of the executive committee of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association in Cheyenne, and normally they kept very, very close and tight records, but this time they didn't keep any record of it. There's no written record of what was happening, but they had this meeting. There was about 45 of them still, and about 25 of them left the meeting in Cheyenne, and they went right over to the train station, and they tried not to attract too much attention. And then a short time later, a train came up from Texas, and on that train there were 25 professional gunfighters hired in Paris, Texas, which was at that time a place where you could go if you were a stock detective in Wyoming. You could go to Paris, Texas, because that's where the bounty hunters were. That was where there was like a fringy kind of lawmen and fringy outlaws, sometimes one and the same, of course, and, bounty hunters and stuff. And, not all of them were that skillful with guns, but they were ready to do what they were told. And they were told, hey, you'll get money if you come with us on this train up to Wyoming, all expenses paid. There's a bunch of rustlers out there we want you to get rid of. So come on. And so it took them about 2 weeks, to gather up 25 of these gunfighters. And they piled on the train, and they came up, from Paris, Texas, and they came through Denver, and they came into Cheyenne. And not only did they have money, and it is a known fact. Let me say their names because it is a known fact. Ex-Governor Baxter, Governor Barber, Dr. Barber. He was a doctor. He was the current governor. And the Senators Warren and Senator Carey, they had cast in their lot with Hubert Teschemacher and Dubillier. Dubillier was Teschemacher's partner. I must say, of course, Teddy Roosevelt was long gone by this time. So let us not include Teddy Roosevelt in this kind of like moral collapse. But he was there before, and he's operating in these opportunistic kind of ways, of course. But now he's gone on from the West, and he's back on the East Coast, But he knew these people in his formative years. And some of the cattle owners, it must be said, they did not go in on this bad scheme. They did not do this bad thing. They did not participate in this invasion of Johnson County, but some of them did do this. And Teschemacher and Dubillier, they were there among the 25 cattle owners who joined with the 25 gunmen who got on that train and went north up from Cheyenne to Casper. And I think they got off of the train in Casper, but they were bankrolled by a lot of those people, and they had money, they had guns, they had dynamite, they had 2 wagons, they had horses, they had the gunmen, and they climbed off of their train. It was April, I think it was in Casper, and then they began to make their way north to Johnson County, Wyoming, in the northern part of the middle of the state. And they had a list, and on that list were some of these independent cowboys, among them an individual named Nate Champion, who they had gone after him before. He used to be the foreman of this Anglo-Irish cattleman, the Seabar Ranch, what was his name, Plunkett, but then he began to develop a little herd of his own, and for that reason he got on their bad list, and they came after him before. Frank Canton and 4 others came to try and do away with him, but he fought back, and it would make a heck of a movie, they didn't get him then, but he was on their list, And anyway, they came north into Johnson County, or they were on their way into Johnson County, and they had this great big list. They were actually intending to assassinate the county commission in Buffalo, Wyoming, the newspaper editor in Buffalo, and the sheriff in Buffalo, the one who had beat Frank Canton, the one Red Angus. They had all these people on a list written down, and they were going to do this. And they had newspapers. 2 newspaper people were with them too, and they had the media, they had the money, and they had the guns, and this is how things are. or this is how things were, or this is what happened, you know. We don't need to draw too many other conclusions from it, but we need to keep our eye on the human drama of this and what motivates people and what is sometimes possible and what people feel entitled to do. So they came, it was in April, it was in 1891, and this is Wyoming, and Old Man Winter had something to say about it. A big blizzard came. And a big blizzard came. They got off that train, and now they were on their horseback, and the horses were kind of funny. They'd been on a train, and the wind was blowing, and it was really cold, and they had a hard time getting going. And but they eventually got underway, and they came into Johnson County. They were some miles south of Buffalo, Wyoming, and then they stopped and realized that they were near to the cabin where one of their chiefest enemies was. That was where Nate Champion was, at the Casey Ranch, near the hole in the wall, actually, where Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid hid. They were the actual rustlers, you know, but they were living in their own wilderness kind of world, and so they were not necessarily near to these centers of political drama and power that were occurring. But it was near that place, the hole in the wall, you know. But Nate Champion was there with a partner of his, and then a couple of trappers who were staying there overnight. And there was Frank Canton, and there was another Frank named Frank Walcott, and they were having a little power struggle about who was going to be in charge of this death posse coming into Wyoming. But now, you know, they stopped at this cabin and they argued for a while, and they thought, well, we got to get Nate Champion first. And so at dawn they started. Two of the people came out, they took them prisoner, and then the shooting started, and then Nate Champion held them off. It's like it's like the Alamo, you know, and they were shooting back and forth, and Nate Champion was a good shot, and a few of them were wounded, and sometimes they realized they were wasting their ammo, so the shooting would go into a lull, and during that time Nate Champion would begin to write and begin to tell about what was happening. And it's very, very interesting. Let me read you just a little part of this now, if I can. Well, writes Nate Champion under fire, well, they have just got through shelling the house like hail. I heard them splitting wood. I guess they are going to fire the house tonight. I think I will make a break when night comes if alive. Shooting again. I think they will fire the house this time. It's not night yet. The house is all fired. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again. You know, he wrote about this. They set fire to a wagon, and they pushed it against the house, and then the flames began to crackle, and Nate Champion made a run for it. And he was able to hold them off for the better part of a day. And even though some of those bad guys had cut the telegraph lines to Buffalo, Wyoming, and so that they couldn't be notified, and even though Governor Barber had specifically given orders to the local cavalry some distance from Buffalo at Fort McKinney, saying to them, the cavalry is not to be mobilized unless by my order, said Governor Barber, who was on the side of the invaders of Johnson County. And, you know, it's a known fact, you know. But anyway, because of Nate Champion, they were held off. Someone was able to, actually one of the cowboy unionists was able to, it's a long story, I don't need to go into all the details, but he was able to elude capture, and he got to Buffalo and was able to tell the people in Buffalo what was going on. And so the people in Buffalo mobilized, and they came down, and the invaders were stopped. The invaders holed up at a ranch nearby, not before getting supplies and fresh horses at one of the ranches owned by Senator Carey or Senator Warren. But later on, they were holed up and besieged in another ranch just south of Buffalo. And the citizens of Buffalo, Wyoming mobilized and stopped their progress so that the county commission and the sheriff, they were not killed. They succeeded in killing Nate Champion who heroically held them off. But they were able to be kind of like besieged and trapped. And then one of their number was able to escape. and get to the telegraph station in Douglas, Wyoming. They couldn't go to Buffalo because they themselves had cut the lines, but they got to Douglas, Wyoming, and they were able to tell the senator and the governor, who then contacted President Benjamin Harrison, who eventually, after several tries, was finally roused from his sleep and was told that there was an insurrection going on in Wyoming and that he needed to mobilize the cavalry. So Benjamin Harrison gave permission to Governor Barber, or was it Governor Barber who on his own impetus gave permission to the cavalry to come down and rescue the bad guys and rescue the invaders and take them prisoner and put them in protective custody. They surrendered to the cavalry, knowing that the cavalry was beholden to the state interests that were on their side. They did not surrender to the local authorities, the sheriff in Buffalo. See, these are complicated kind of jurisdictional questions which are being played out in these very charged circumstances, and it's complicated, but this is basically, what happened. And then they were taken prisoner, the invasion was stopped, all the other further bad things did not happen, but other bad things happened in the area of miscarriages of justice. They were taken into custody in Fort McKinney. There was a particular individual named Van Devander, Willis Van Devanter, I think that was his name. You'll hear more about him, though. He was a lawyer in Cheyenne. And some of the cowboys that were on the death list started their own stock growers association and even had the temerity to have their own roundup independently of the larger Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which caused the Wyoming Stock Growers Organization to hire this Willis Van Devanter, this Cheyenne lawyer, who attacked them and filed court papers calling them rustler, and they sicked this lawyer on them. And the same lawyer, Van Devanter, was able to corral the offenders, the gunmen and the cattlemen, and establish that they were to be tried in mass, and it was going to be on the it was going to be the financial burden of Johnson County to try all of them in mass, and they made sure that the prosecuting attorneys, if there were any indeed, were not able to interview them, so that none of them were able to turn state's evidence. They couldn't even meet with them, and they delayed the proceedings, and they seeded the press, and they were able to delay the trial, and they were able to change the venue from Laramie to Cheyenne, and yet to transfer the charges to Johnson County, and eventually they just couldn't even assemble a jury. And so this was in April, and by August, after all these machinations, essentially the gunmen and the cattlemen were freed, and they made sure by legal maneuvering that they could not be tried again once the case was dismissed. And then all the gunmen were celebrated in a big party in Cheyenne, and they had not drunk champagne before, and they got really, loaded, and they picked fights with each other. And then the next day they put them on a train all hungover, and they went down to Oklahoma, and at the Oklahoma-Texas border they were each given $700. And, and then their story goes on, some of them. As for the lawyer, Willis Van Devanter, he was rewarded for the things that he had done. Later on, he became an assistant attorney general for the Department of the Interior. And later on, Teddy Roosevelt, whom we admire in so many ways, but he was also a politician, and he must have known Willis Van Devanter from back in his Wyoming days. And it was Teddy Roosevelt who gave him an appointment to a circuit court in Washington, D.C. And it was Robert Taft who made Willis Van Devanter a Supreme Court judge. And Willis Van Devanter became a Supreme Court judge. And guess what? He stayed a Supreme Court judge well into his 80s. And guess what? He was among what they called the Four Horsemen, who were the ones who did everything that they could do to block FDR's New Deal, in the Supreme Court. And the story tells us he destroyed a lot of the records from his days in Wyoming, but he did become a Supreme Court judge, and he did behave in a certain way. And it's right there in our history for us to understand and contemplate. And so, we're left with a touch of that. But, we're left with a touch of a lot of other things, and I've only been able to touch on just a little part of this whole Johnson County Cattle War, but I can see that the time is doing what the time does. So let me just do something really quick if I can. Our friend Gary Snyder, the poet. Let's remember this. Okay, what can I tell you? We have done a lot of work this evening with larger-than-life personalities, in larger-than-life settings, with larger-than-life transgressions of morality. But let's not forget what history fails to mention is. And this is a little poem by Gary Snyder, who tells us what history fails to mention is. What history fails to mention is most everybody lived their lives with friends and children, played it cool, left truth and beauty to the guys who tricked for big shots and were fools. What history fails to mention is most everybody lived their lives with friends and children, played it cool, left truth and beauty to the guys who tricked for big shots and were fools. And so, what that means is, in our little sketch, of monumental hubris and folly, let us keep in mind that the public domain lands and that the law in its infancy was also at the same time making it possible for people to come who would live in kind of a different way than these larger-than-life personalities. And the value of their life would be something that was like closer to the real way that people live, only it would not be lived at such a large and grandiose scale as some of this other stuff that we're talking about, which is so interesting and which is so fascinating. But there's something to be said for those who let the great wheel of history go rolling on by, and they're living within the shell of the old society, and slowly and humbly they are reviving it from within. Much like Abraham Lincoln. Let's put it this way. As, Walt Whitman might have put it for us. And as Teddy Roosevelt put it in a certain way. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt would say, well, I succeeded because of daring, and I did these great things, and I guess I also did these bad things, but I was a man of action. It was all because of what I had to do under the weight of my fate. But then there's also, and I understand it as Teddy Roosevelt, there was also Abraham Lincoln, who paced the basement hallways of the White House, conceiving in his stressed mind of a new way of understanding this nation. And actually, those of us who are living our lives right now, and with every thought passing by, even though it doesn't touch on the great currents of obvious and received history, we are sharers of the pain and the inspiration of Abraham Lincoln, because we are the people. We are the people when we seek to understand these large and strange travesties that are inheritance, as inheritors of the American story. But what we are doing in our own selves individually, we're like seeds of leaves of grass, e pluribus unum, right, out of many one, a unity of purpose, a unity of moral purpose. Our purpose right now being to understand what it was that happened in the Johnson County Cattle War, and the strange threads of free association that I've placed before you now. I hope it's worthwhile to you. And so at this point in time, I have to commend myself to your heroic listening, and let us all make some further fulfillment of whatever there is that is of value in the story as it has been related to you this evening. So I thank you for your heroic listening, and I must say to you, so long for now, as we continue on this American experiment and come to understand the forces that play their part in so many ways. All right. Alrighty then, so long for now.